Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Cyber Pulse podcast. I took a break without intentionally wanting to take a break, so such things happen. But now I'm back. So let's be clear. When tensions rise in the Middle East, cyber activity doesn't just increase, it becomes part of the environment. Therefore, it's not a separate thing from what's happening right now, it's kind of part of it. It moves alongside or with it in a way. And while a lot of this activity isn't always visible or publicly discussed, it's there and is shaping how organizations are being targeted, how are they being approached, and sometimes how are they being tested. So today's conversation isn't about asking if cyber is involved or not, because we all know it is. It's about understanding what it actually looks like and what it means for organizations operating in the region today. I'm joined by a very interesting guest today. His name is Aaron Aubrey, and he brings strong experience in threat intelligence, and he has deep visibility into how these situations influence cyber activity. So, Aaron, before we move along with the conversation, can you please introduce yourself to the audience and tell them a little bit about yourself?
Of course. So I'm Aaron. I'm very happy to be here first and foremost. So thank you for having me on this episode. And we are going to be talking about a very timely topic, right? I think it doesn't get more timely than this. So it's really a pleasure to be here. But just a little quick background about myself. I'm Aaron. I'm currently based in Dubai, but I'm originally from Singapore. That may explain, a bit of the strange accent that I may have. I've been living in the Middle East for the last 3 years. I'm currently work for a little known cybersecurity company known as CrowdStrike. Been at the company for the last 5 years. I have an official title of being a security or systems engineer at the company. But really, what I do is I really serve in the capacity of a subject matter expert in threat intelligence. And what that really entails is, on top of talking about what CrowdStrike has to offer in terms of a threat intelligence capability. More importantly, I'm often involved in conversations with customers, with users about the best practices, right, to adopt threat intelligence in their environment. I also spend a bit of time doing some thought leadership initiatives, sharing with not only the customers but beyond, right, sharing with the community, whether that means having conversations at security conferences, forums to talk about the latest threat trends or what we are seeing out there in the wild. And also I spend time helping organizations build their threat intelligence capability. So that entails offering custom intelligence enablement, training, program development initiatives, right? And prior to CrowdStrike, I basically spent my entire career in the threat intelligence space. So prior to CrowdStrike, I worked at this company called Recorder Future. That was when I was back in Singapore. I spent 2 years at the company and was the first local hire in the company. And at that point in time, Recorder Future is a much smaller company. I spent my 2 years there as a consultant. I'm helping customers across the public sector, private sector, to help them think about operationalizing threat intelligence in their environment.
It seems like threat intelligence is your main domain in this, right?
Oh yes, for sure, for sure. Because even before the private sector, I spent my career doing from I spent my the first decade of my professional career in the military, where I spent 10 years as an intelligence officer in the Singapore military. Started off as a intelligence officer in the traditional side of intelligence. I did imagery intelligence, signals intelligence, and so on and so forth. Before spending the last about 3 years of my military career to then help establish the nascent cyber command in Singapore, right? And because of my allegiance to the intelligence core, I had the privilege, right, and the opportunity to build the CTI capability for the Ministry of Defense from the ground up. So that was really my first venture into cybersecurity, into cyber threat intelligence. Really had a great time building the collection capabilities, the analysis capabilities. Had the opportunity to collaborate across multiple government agencies in Singapore at the national level with the National Cybersecurity Agency, and also with the Ministry of Home Affairs, which is the Homeland Security equivalent, and the National Intelligence Agencies. So I did that for a good number of about 3 years. And then, I felt that, the private sector was probably going to be more exciting for me. So I left and spent the last, almost 7 years in the private sector now. So that's a quick introduction to myself, I hope.
Interesting, Aaron. It seems like you are the perfect guest for today's episode. So I just want you to look into what's happening in the region currently. I'm sure you're aware of what's happening. When we look at the current situation in the region, how would you describe the threat landscape right now?
Right. So that's a great question, right? And I think it's a great place to begin this conversation. But before I do that, I do want to set some caveats. And these caveats are important because it actually frames the conversation that we're about to have. Right. So first, I think we, to kind of just to put it out there, right? We are going to be talking about primarily what's happening in Iran right now. We're going to be talking about the American and Israeli like war or conflict in the country. We're going to focus a lot of the conversation around the cyber aspects of things. So, what we have seen on both sides of the coin. Right? But I think the first caveat that I would like to make is that, we have to first acknowledge that this is a ongoing dynamic situation. So, for the purpose of this episode, we are having this conversation on Monday, the 30th March, around like almost 5:30 p.m., right? Time in Doha, right? The reason why I want to note the timestamp is because I think based on what has transpired over the weekend, there is likely escalation that's going to happen in the conflict.
Of course.
Announcing their former involvement, right? Potential US boots on the ground, right? And this would very likely change the situation in cyberspace. So I want to first make that caveat, right?
Okay.
And then the second caveat that I also like to make is that, what I'm going to be able to share and what we're going to be able to discuss is also contingent to some of the visibility gaps, right? It's contingent on some visibility gaps. So, for example, right, there is some degree of awareness of what has transpired on the American front when it comes to cyber operations within Iran in the lead up to the conflict and in the early days of the conflict. But right now, I'll be very honest and tell you upfront that, if you ask me what has transpired on the American Israeli front over the past week or the past 2 weeks, right, not much is known, right, because there is an ongoing shutdown in Iran. So by virtue of that, right, it's very difficult to even figure out like what are the cyber effects, right, quote unquote cyber effects that are taking place in Iran as we speak. So that's the first visibility gap. Right? The second visibility gap is the extent of the actual disruption that we're going to discuss, right, that's been caused by some of the Iranian state nexus cyber operators. A lot of that remains to be unknown, right? Because, as we can expect, right, beyond the context of this conflict, when it comes to victims, right, of unfortunate cyber attacks, generally speaking, because of, confidentiality issues, right, and potential reputational like, risk, not a lot is known. So a lot of the targets like of the Iranian the recent cyber operations, right, there's only this much that we know, right? So that there's a gap there. And last but not least, one of the key topics that we will probably discuss as part of this conversation is that there is a slice of cyber activities that's associated with targeting industrial control systems, right, or operational technology, right? And on that front, I'll be the first to confess that, again, my visibility in that space is generally quite poor, and I'm not a subject matter expert in that space. So I'll be able to discuss insofar to what I'm aware that's happening in that space. But I want to caveat that there's a lot that's probably happening and we do and I'm not necessarily privy to that. And then the last thing that I just want to say before we go into the heart of the matter is that, whatever I'm going to be sharing from this point on is really a function of my personal opinion. The views are my own and they do not represent, any entity that I may affiliate or associated with. So with that out of the way, I can now answer the question, right? Right. So as we all know, right, since the 28th of February, so if you guys are for the listeners, over this past weekend, we have actually arrived at the unfortunate month anniversary of the start of the conflict. So, just to quickly set the stage, as we all should be well aware by now, there was a preemptive strike, right, that was conducted by the Americans and the Israeli joint forces on Iran, right, targeting multiple, infrastructure and personalities that are associated with the strategic leadership of the country and the strategic bodies and agencies that run the country, right, the IRGC, the related like public sector agencies, and so on and so forth. And in after the strikes, right, and as part of the ongoing conflict, right, there's still a lot of kinetic action that has been happening, and in response, in retaliation,
Yeah.
there is both the Iranians have retaliated both physically, right, and also like through the missiles, through the drone attacks, through the isolated missile strikes on on many countries, unfortunately in the Gulf, right, especially the ones that are perceived to be allies of the Americans and the Israelis, right, and as part of this retaliation, right, there's also an ongoing, sustained set of cyber operations that have been happening, that have been targeting entities in the US, in Israel, and also many of the Gulf nations, and basically any country or entity that's considered to be a potential ally or perceived to be an ally of the belligerents, right, is basically fair game, right, for these cyber operations. So I think I'll stop here first, and then we can continue on to get into some of the more into the details accordingly.
Yeah, I think you painted a very detailed threat landscape at the moment. It's nice to have, and with that, we will move forward with it based on what you have painted. So, during periods like this, during periods of geopolitical tension, are we actually seeing a meaningful shift in cyber activity, or is it more of an increase in what's already happening, or what's already like what's something we're already used to seeing? Or is there a shift towards something else?
That's a great question. It's great because I would say that the answer, this question that you just asked, right, the answer would actually kind of differ between who you actually ask the question to, right? So the reason why I start with that response is because for somebody like me, I've had the privilege of monitoring state nexus cyber activity for a good amount of time now. So actually, if you were to ask somebody like me, I would say that it's kind of like almost business as usual, but kind of like in certain aspects of the activity, right, it's going to be like heightened in nature. So let me explain what that really means, right? So I think our first make to be fair to this conversation, I think there are two trends that I want to spend some time talking about. So first, when we look at how warfare has evolved, like the modern conflict and how warfare has evolved, I think something that we can agree that, and it's been consistently observed, is that now cyber operations is now fairly well integrated into kinetic operations, right? So in traditional warfare, we see a lot of kinetic operations, anything that involves maneuvers like missile strikes, right, or like ground warfare, air warfare, anything that happens in the air, land, and sea is considered a kinetic operation. But we have also started to see the use of cyber alongside information levers, right, to deliver non-kinetic effects, right? In this particular conflict, we have seen the Americans and the Israelis, doing so again. So we can explore, what are some of the activities that transpired. But I feel like that the first point that I want to make is that is going to be the notion of integrating cyber into modern warfare is going to be here to stay. Right? And countries, like it or not, right? And I like to think of myself as a political realist. Right? Is that countries are going to observe what has happened, and they're gonna think about how they can adapt some of these tactics and techniques, right, from a warfare perspective, and integrate it into their playbooks, right, for their future disposal, right. So that's the first thing. And then the second key trend, right, is that, and this really speaks to the whole piece about why I feel to a certain extent that what has been observed is kind of like business as usual, but in certain aspects, right, it's a lot is happening at a greater volume, right, or at a greater concentration. The reason why I made that is because if you look at historically how the Iranians might have taken to cyber operations to perform, to achieve their set of strategic objectives. But I think you can say that generally speaking, there are four key activities and objectives, right, that the Iranians have historically used cyber to achieve, right. So first, just like with any other state nexus actor, they use cyber to perform intelligence collection, a lot of political espionage, some degree of economic espionage in the recent years, right. And then there is what the Iranians are known for, what is known in the community now as a hack and leak operation, right? And this really entails assuming the persona of a cyber criminal or hacktivist to target your specific organization with ransomware, with a commodity wiper, right? And generally speaking, the information that is stolen is then leaked on some kind of dedicated leak site or some kind of messaging platform like Telegram, right? The goal here is to cause disruption, right, through the ransomware attack or through the wiper attack, and to then undermine, right, the credibility, the public trust, right, in the organizations that they target. And then there's also a lot of information manipulation and interference. This happens, it's not unique to Iran, right? I can talk about so many other countries that do so, but the goal here is to use cyber means, right, to shape, right, public opinion, to deliver certain narratives, right, that is typically pro-regime and is anti, right, their adversaries. And last but not least, cyber has also been used for domestic surveillance. I think we can all, it's a fair statement to make, right, that the Iranian regime is generally considered to be a highly authoritarian one. Many of the recent protests, right, that actually then lead up to this current conflict, right, was born out of the repression, right, of the regime. So as you can imagine, the Ministry of Intelligence, the MOIS, right, the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, which is the intelligence agency within the Iranian regime, and the IRGC, right, will turn to cyber means, right, to perform domestic surveillance. So with these four general types of operations and objectives that we have seen historically, right? With the Iranian regime and their use of cyber as a form of state power. A lot of it is still happening as we speak, right? Since in the lead up to the conflict and right as we speak in the past month or so of the conflict. What has changed, right, is that we have seen, I would say, on the hack front, like it has surged significantly in volume. If you are familiar with, if you've been tracking the conflict, you would know that Handala hack team, right, has very very active, right, in performing a series of very brazen hack operations that we can talk about as part of this episode. But yeah, that is it's kind of like business as usual, but it's a lot more brazen, a lot more aggressive, and a lot and the organizations that they go after are are high profile organizations, like with the goal of undermining credibility, exaggerating to demonstrate their cyber capability in order to impose costs, right, on their adversaries.
Interesting perspective, Aaron. I've seen that. I heard like you're talking a lot about how the Iranian side is doing or conducting a lot of the cyber activity. However, from your perspective, do you think this is happening from both ends? Or is it more of just involvement from one side? Like only the Iranians, for example, are very good at performing such things. Like what about Israel and the US? Do you think they're fighting back when it comes to such things?
Oh, 100% they are. They are fighting back, right? The only reason why, okay, this is where it gets a bit, juicy, right? Like my personal perspective, right, is that, at the end of the day, the global media is still very much dominated by quote unquote the Western media. Just by inherently, that is the media landscape today, right? You're just gonna fundamentally get, often the Western narrative of what's happening, right? And of course, there's a lot of reporting that's being done. There's a lot of open reporting that's being done. Liberal, like the rest of the world is also a lot more liberal in terms of their media culture. So a lot of, as a result, right? And then you think about how inherently the Iranian operations, the elite operations, are meant to be driving visibility, right? It's actually the media's, you can argue that the media is kind of playing into the hands of the Iranians because they are amplifying, right, the high elite operations, right? So there's a lot of amplification that's already happening inherently and also by design. But if you think about quote unquote on the flip side of the coin, right? Your question around whether I think the Americans the Israelis and or for that matter, right, other nations, right, are retaliating, right? The answer is that there isn't much public evidence that indicates that is happening. But I would be the first, right, to go on record to say that it's definitely happening, right? It's just that the retaliation is not going to be a like for like retaliation, right? Because it's not the West, it's not the modus operandi to kind of retaliate a hack and link operation with a hack and link operation.
I understand where you're coming from and what you mean. So I guess what I'm trying to say is in the news, I've always heard or read something that says Iranian hackers, Russian hackers, Chinese hackers. I've never read something that said American hacker or Israeli
You're
hacker.
absolutely right.
Why is that?
You are absolutely right.
Why is that?
Why is that? Okay, so I love where we're going with this conversation, right? So there are a few. I mean, not to go down into that rabbit hole. I would say that there are few general reasons why, like there are two kind of like key hypotheses that you see. And I use the word hypothesis very deliberately, right? There are two hypotheses that I have for this reason, right? So first, it goes back to the fact that the point that I made earlier about the media landscape, right? The media landscape today, like it or not, is still, I think we can all agree, regardless of which part of the world you're from, that is still dominated by Western media, right? And for that reason, there are, whether you believe, right, by extension, right, that there is some typical agreement, right, for, in the name of national security, in the name of operational security, right, that prevents the media outlets, right, from openly covering the Western, quote unquote, the Western cyber capabilities as openly, as publicly as the non-Western world, right? So there's that piece. The second hypothesis is that this is where it gets a bit subjective, right? Because one could also argue that the reason why you don't hear about the Western cyber operations is because they're just a lot better at what they do, right? And the goal, and the goal, and it could be directly linked to not only their operational capabilities, but to the intended objective of their operations, right? Because if their intended objective of their operations is, say, espionage, say, intelligence collection, then the inherent nature of that mission is stealth, is persistence. Right?
Exactly.
So Yeah, and for that reason, right? And if they're at what they do, right? And if you believe that they're good at what they do, they would not get caught, right? And if they get caught, right? Look at if you think about the countries that they will typically go after, right? The common suspects, right? They will go after Russia and China, for example,
True, yeah.
for espionage reasons. Do you think the Russian and Chinese press is going to report that? Because how would that, how would that look? What kind of reputational like damage that could potentially be, right, on the regimes that are running those countries, right? Is generally, in my perspective, I think it would be too sensitive, right? It will hurt their sensibilities, right? And therefore, even if there are American espionage operations that have been, detected in China, right? How often that report gets to see the light of day, and how much of China, how much like Chinese, how much press reporting you're gonna get from the Chinese state news agencies, right? I've only seen, I think, twice or thrice in the last 15 years I've been in this in this domain.
Interesting perspective, to be honest. I never thought about it that way, but it's a fair game, I guess. So, from your perspective, does the intent behind the attacks change during such periods?
That's a good question. I think the intent hasn't changed in terms of like how the cyber operations have been wielded to achieve their intended goals. I think the question is really, if I were to put myself in, say, the shoes of the Iranian regime right now, if I'm thinking about the future of cyber operations in Iran for as long as the conflict is going to continue, I think the question is really to what end, right? Because there are a few right now. What we are seeing is in the recent 2 weeks, I would say there's been a lot of tit for tat targeting. So
True.
a lot of like, if you look at Handala's hack teams, like recent wiper attacks or
Yes.
the leaks, they are generally the justification that they provide is almost in response, right, to something that the Americans or the Israelis just did, right? And it sounds almost like tit for tat, like revenge, right? And if you think about, if that cannot be the case, right? Because if the goal is to achieve some kind of decisive outcome, right, to end the conflict, or to move the geopolitical situation to a point where the conflict can be resolved, right? The question, right, if I'm a war planner, for example, like
Yeah.
how would I be thinking about using cyber to do that? Because the effects of cyber is very non-deterministic in nature, right? As much as I hate to use this analogy, right? A missile strike is a missile strike, right? When you conduct a kinetic strike on a target, right? The target, you know with a certain certainty on the destruction they are causing, the physical destruction they are causing,
Yes.
and then the consequence of the attack is very clear, right? That a particular high value target is being removed, right, and so on and so forth. For example, or a particular military capability is being crippled, like how the Americans were going after the Iranian Navy for a while.
But
But in cyber,
that's not the same
it
in the
is
cyber world, though.
exactly. It is so non-deterministic, right? It's very a lot of the hack operations that the Iranians have been undertaking is psychological in nature, right? If you think about what the goal is psychological in nature. So my question then is, and I don't have an answer to this question, right? And I'm an intelligence, I still suffer the occupational hazards of being a former intelligence officer. So all I do is ask questions that I do not have answers to, right? And then
It's your
I
right.
have right my
It's your right to ask.
the question is are we gonna see, if I think through the history of warfare, right, the history of modern conflict, the one that I'm thinking about right now is actually the Vietnam War, right? And if you think about what happened in the Vietnam War, was that at the end of the day, right, the Americans can claim that there was a military victory, right, because of the overwhelming combat power, the overwhelming physical destruction, right, that they have managed to, unfortunately, right, they basically hit the Viet Cong, right, to his knees. But it was a political disaster. It was a political failure because the Viet Congs were eventually able to degrade popular support, right, in America for the conflict to a point where basically the political will to sustain the conflict is gone, right?
Yes.
So then the question is, now we kind of use that lesson learned, right? We
Yes.
kind of map it into this current conflict, right? The question is, what is it going to take? Right? Again, if I put myself in the shoes of the Iranian regime, and the goal is to come to some kind of conclusion, right? The question is, how do I, what can I do, right, to degrade, right, the political will, right, to degrade popular support for the conflict, right? I mean, we can see on the news, right? If you believe what you see, right, and I'm gonna still believe what I see, right, for now, right? The support, right, over the last especially the last 2 weeks, right, popular support, domestic support for the conflict has significantly dwindled, right, in America. Right? So the
Yeah,
question is,
true.
what is it going to take? Like, when is it going to be enough, right, for basically President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu to call an end to the conflict? And then the question then is, where does cyber play a role in that effect, right? And and that's the question that I cannot answer. And I think it begs, right, the entire community, right, to continue to watch this space to kind of see what happened, because I do think that a lot of interesting lessons learned, right, would come from from observing how cyber is being wielded, right, in this particular conflict.
True. Interesting perspective. That's a nice way of putting it. Aaron, are organizations in the Middle East being directly targeted, or are they part of broader campaigns that expand into the region?
That's a question, and I suspect you already know the answer to the question. And the reality is that I like to kind of think about this as broadly as possible, because at the end of the day, cyber is just by means to an end, right? And cyber, for those of us who have been observing this space for a while now already, especially with how the Iranians have used cyber, like we earlier discussed on the four key objectives, right? But a simple way to put it, right, is to think about how cyber continues to be part of Iran's like asymmetric strategy, right? Because they know that their traditional combat capabilities is gonna be inferior, right, to the Americans, to the Israelis, and to a certain extent, even many of the Gulf nations, right, can pose, right, a superior, right, military capability to Iran. And for that reason, right, Iran has been, and this has been on full display, right, in the context of this conflict, right? They've been using a lot of asymmetric tactics, right, to basically impose cost on who they deem to be their adversaries, right? So a lot obviously has been done to the on the American, the Israeli front, but as for the close observers of the conflict, we will be well aware, right, that there's also a lot of many of the operations also targeted many countries in the Gulf. The earliest targeting started, I think, less than a week into the conflict, and it continues right up to this point in time, right? And you can think about this again. You can think about how cyber plays like that role in the asymmetric warfare, right? So if you think about how basically Iran has been lobbing isolated missiles, short-range missiles, drones, right, at the Gulf, targeting critical infrastructure, targeting energy, targeting American bases, right? The cyber is just part of that overarching, the asymmetric campaign, right, that they are doing in order to impose costs, right, on the belligerents, on their perceived adversaries, right, and cause disruption, right, not only in what they've been doing with the Strait of Hormuz, right, with the physical airspace, targeting critical infrastructure, but also doing so, right, in interrupting, disrupting the business operations of many of the entities that operate in the Gulf that are considered to be sympathetic, right, or supporting the belligerents of the conflict.
Interesting. So, Ara, let me ask you this. How important is it for organizations to understand the context behind what they're saying rather than just seeing the activity itself?
That is a great question. I personally do not think that there is. I think they are both important.
Okay.
So, and this speaks to the value of intelligence and how to maximize the utility of intelligence or threat intelligence in an organization, right? Because yes, one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about is the fact that I generally think that the value of threat intelligence is still generally underutilized today, and underutilized because today the implementation of threat intelligence is mostly as an operational enabler, as a tactical enabler, right? And that's where understanding the tactics, techniques, and procedures of an adversary, of an organization, potential adversary, is really important, right? Because you can then do threat hunting, you can then improve and enhance your efficacies, and so forth, right? You do cyber security
Yeah.
better, right? But to your point, right, it is also equally important to understand the geopolitical context, the macro drivers of of potential adversaries, right? And the reason why that is important is because if it to me that is the first order task, right? Like if you do that well, for example, if you are able to identify your potential adversaries, you understand what motivates them, and therefore by extension why they may potentially target you as an organization, you'll be able to develop a way more robust threat model for your organization. And then the threat model anchors everything and anything that you do in security, right? So if you are a believer, right, in doing the right things right, right, you want to start you want to adopt a first principles approach towards security, right? Then I would highly advocate, right? I'll highly encourage organizations that have that philosophy, right, to understand, right, to develop their macro understanding of your potential adversary, develop macro understanding of how the threat landscape is evolving, right? What are some emergent trends that are coming across the horizon, so that you can truly be proactive, right? And this knowledge, right, this wisdom informs, right, the actions that you do at the operational level, at a tactical level in cybersecurity. And then as a whole, right, you become a lot more effective. You become a lot more, you are able to stay on the front foot of the adversaries, right? The you don't wait till basically ransomware becomes ransomware,
Yeah.
and then you figure out how you defend against ransomware, for example.
Interesting. So you're kind of saying you want organizations to build based on the threat landscape. They build their cyber capabilities based on the threat landscape.
Exactly, like an adversary. I mean, I like to refer to it as like a threat-centric or adversary-centric approach, right? Because at the end of the day, cybersecurity exists really for the reason of protecting the organization, right? In the art of war, right? If you know yourself, you know your enemy, right? In the house, you will not falter, right? So the mission of a cybersecurity team, I would argue, right, is to protect your organization against the potential adversaries. You're not protecting your organization from some hypothetical threat that doesn't exist, right? And the reason for the existence of a cybersecurity organization exists because, first and foremost, the adversaries exist, right? So if you're not basing, you're not framing, right, your security posture, your decisions, right, whether is it in people, process, and technology, right, associated security, based on the threat landscape, based on the adversaries that could be targeting your organization, then I think you're just honestly wasting time. You're not doing things right. You're not doing the right things right.
I agree, to be honest. I truly do agree. Aaron, so how can organizations stay aware of what's happening without overreacting or treating everything as a high risk?
That's a great question. I mean, that's a very useful question, and let's discuss this in the context of the current conflict, right? Because that will offer a way more grounded and meaningful, right, discussion around this particular question that you just asked. I would say that I think there are like kind of two parts to it, right?
Okay.
First is really situational awareness, right? The importance of being able to develop general situational awareness around what's happening. I'm not asking. I mean, ideally, right? For example, in the context of this conflict, I've already alluded to this particular adversary for a good number of times already, right? The handler hack team, right? The persona that this and state access adversary goes by. Right? It would be ideal, right? If you have monitoring, if you have situational awareness around what they're posting on the Telegram channels, right, or on their dedicated link sites, because that will give you real-time insights into how the adversary is targeting, right? What are the most current victimology trends? That will be an ideal, right? But if you can't achieve that, or you do not have an existing tool to help you do that, right? At least keep up with the news, right? At least
Yeah.
start your day, right? Especially if you are in the Gulf, right?
Hmm.
Start your day with like leveling up on what has happened in the last 24 hours. And trust me, there's enough that happens every 24 hours, every 24-hour cycle in this conflict, right? That will warrant a potential shift in the cyber threat landscape that we need to keep on top of. Keep on top of. Then, so that's the situational awareness piece. And then the second piece, which is related, is around how do we then translate, right, the situational awareness into a meaningful understanding that we can then implement, right, to improve our security, right? So you you alluded to it earlier. You alluded to this earlier in our conversation in an earlier question, right? But I think one simple way to think about this is to look at in the context of this conflict, right? Look at the most prolific adversaries that are clearly operational and very active. Think about whether they may be motivated, right, to target your organization, right? And if the answer is yes, right, then you want to be able to at least develop an understanding of what their current tactics and techniques are, so that you can then validate, right, internally whether you have the appropriate hardening measures in place, right, the appropriate security controls in place, right, to protect your organization, right, from, say, for example, the likes of Handala hack team, because we have already established that there's an adversary that's very active and very relevant, right, in the context of this particular conflict.
Interesting. I think that's very good advice, to be honest. So let me ask you this. If there's one thing people misunderstand about cyber activity during geopolitical tensions, what would you say this misunderstanding is?
That is wow. That's actually a really really awesome question. I do think that generally speaking, there is when we think about the use of cyber in the context of modern conflict, there is for good reason and for not so good reasons. I think that there's a general emphasis or there's a lot more coverage, right, on the attacks, on the intrusions, right, that are a lot noisier in nature or a lot more disruptive in nature. And you think about why that happens, right? It's almost inherent, right? Like the earlier part of our conversation, we say that because we had this question why the Western media seems to only cover, right, or the global media only seems to cover Iranian attacks, for example, right, in this context, Iranian cyber attacks, and not so much about the US and the Israeli cyber operations, right? It's because as per the intended objectives of a hack and leak operation, right, the goal is visibility, right? So the media is actually doing the Iranians a favor by amplifying those attacks, right? And if you extrapolate beyond the immediate context of this conversation or this context of this current conflict, if you think about, say, for example, cybercrime, right? You hear a lot of, reports on like the worst, the most disruptive, right, ransomware attacks, right? The ones that contain that causes the most amount of disruption. These are the ones that are usually highly visible, right? I think what people kind of like misses the point is that cyber is, if you think about this in the context of states, right, or for geopolitics, a lot of cyber today is actually still primarily used for intelligence collection, right? And because of the stealthy nature of these operations, right, this is a part that you generally don't hear much about. There isn't much conversations about, but it is what it is, right? Like cyber is an extension of signals intelligence, right? And cyber is going to be here to stay because there's a lot of utility of cyber as a tool for espionage, right? And that's the first, like, I would say, like, that to me, when you think about this in the context of state on state conflict or geopolitics, that is probably the biggest misconception, or the kind of like the unsaid fact, right, about cyber operations. The other point that I'll just make is that we spend a lot. I know we've been having this conversation, right, in the context of the current ongoing geopolitical situation, the ongoing conflict, right, in the Gulf. But I think an important point to acknowledge, right, is that the reality is that cybercrime, in my opinion, is actually the bigger problem, right? Because cybercrime, and we have numbers to back this up, right? Cybercrime actually dominates the threat landscape, right? 80% of all the intrusions that we observe globally at any point in time in the last 3 to 4 years is financially motivated and is perpetrated by cyber criminals, right? So that to me should be like, if you are, if a listener is listening to this episode and they are just starting on their cyber security journey or starting on their cyber threat intelligence journey or thinking about threat modeling, I would be the first. I know the entire spirit of this conversation was to talk about state actors, right? But I'll be the first to advise that focus on the cybercrime problem first, because the cybercrime problem is more likely to impact you as an organization. So you want to spend more time, right, building threat models around that, right? Thinking about how your security workflows are gonna, your security controls, your security workflows is gonna go up against, right, the current tactics and techniques of cyber criminals. So I didn't mean to digress into cybercrime, but that's something that I wanted to kind of just,
No,
stir.
I kind of agree. You pointed it out. This is our reality. They need to know it.
That's amazing. Yeah.
So before we wrap up, I have one more question for you, Aaron. If you would recommend anyone, or if you'd like to see anyone on the Cyber Pulse podcast, who would you recommend, or who would you like to see next?
That's an amazing question. I have many good friends whom I know are gonna be really really awesome on a podcast. I would let me see. I would give a call out to a good friend of mine. He's a gentleman who also has a very interesting background in threat intelligence, not too dissimilar from myself. I don't know if you know him personally. This gentleman, this Dutch gentleman by the name of Renzi Jongman. He's a former Mandian Google threat intelligence consultant. He currently works for the Department of Government Enablement in Abu Dhabi for the UAE government. He's a former policeman from the Netherlands, where he's originally from.
I heard about him, but I don't know him personally. But
He's an amazing guy.
I'll try to catch
He's an amazing guy that you want to have. Yeah, and if you want my, if I'm more than happy to make that introduction, and I'm sure he will he'll quickly take up your offer and would feature in one of the upcoming episodes.
Great. I'd love to have him on board. Let's see if we can build upon that. Thank you for your time, Aaron. This was amazing. I really enjoyed our conversation and I hope you had fun too.
I really enjoyed myself and I look forward to be back.
And to everyone listening, this conversation wasn't about raising concern. It was about raising awareness because the activity is there and it's always going to be there, whether it's visible or not. And understanding that activity is always going to be there is what helps organizations respond in a way that's measured, realistic, and informed. See you in the next episode. Take care.